Hi, this is Anne-Marie Paquette, the Director of Education with the Mosby Heritage Area Association, and I'm here to bring you another look at a topic that we were talking about this week. So those of you who are reading our blog, this week's blog was about Richard Norris Brooke, who was a Warrenton native and also a very well-known artist in his time. He was active for about 50 years around the turn of the 20th century. And while our blog post talks about some of the works that made him famous, today we're going to talk about a piece that may be, if not as well known, may be viewed just as often as the ones we discussed in the blog. So, to make a long story short, in about 1880, Brooke was commissioned by the House of Representatives to paint a portrait of Chief Justice John Marshall. Now, this fits in pretty well with what Brooke may be doing already at this time, and not in the least because both Richard Norris Brooke and Chief Justice John Marshall are natives of Fauquier County. And so it just so happens that Brooke is already familiar with Marshall. They would have socialized with some of the same families. The only difficulty is that John Marshall had passed away some 45 years prior to this. But in the painting world, it was very common to paint a portrait of a picture or another painted portrait to use as a basis. And so that brings us into this interesting conundrum where Brooke's painting is actually a portrait of a portrait of a portrait of Chief Justice John Marshall. So we're going to dive in a little bit and talk about some of the history of those pieces. I'm going to start by attempting a share screen. All right, so here we are. This is an original 1831 portrait of Chief Justice John Marshall. This was painted by Henry Inman in Philadelphia, again in 1831. Now, at this time, Marshall was actually in town in Philadelphia waiting for surgery. He was going to undergo a procedure. And so in the days prior, Henry Inman had him sit and do this portrait. It was a commission by a group of admiring Philadelphia lawyers. It's now in the possession of the Philadelphia Bar Association. And Marshall, you can see here, he's portrayed in a somber, well-fitted coat. He's got his stock tie. You can see he has a trusty law book in his hand. But the rest of the background is a little more nuanced, a little more murky. We're not given a setting. This is very much focused on Marshall, his face, his composure. We can tell that he's aged here, of course, but he still looks very steady and very stoic, which is very fitting for a man who, built the Supreme Court, built the judicial system to be really what it is today and what it was at this time. So 1831, Inman does this portrait. He has already Inman has partnered with an engraver, Cephas Childs, who's going to start mass producing this portrait, as soon as possible. Marshall himself was so taken with this image that he asked Inman to do a second one, basically a mock-up of this same exact piece, for Richmond so he could take it home with him. And so that is the case. So by 1830, 1832, we already have many images of this one painting being produced. For those interested, this piece is often regarded as the official portrait of John Marshall. We're going to fast forward. And in 1859, Fauquier, the county, actually commissions another portrait of John Marshall. Again, this one would be done posthumously. They award the commission to a locally born artist, but someone who was becoming much better known. And that, of course, was William Dickinson Washington, who was born just outside of Snickersville. So again, a heritage area individual. And he had been a professional artist for several decades before this, about 10, 15 years. He had studied abroad. He had also opened a gallery in Washington, D.C., and then during the Civil War had moved his gallery to Richmond. So he was definitely a Southern sympathizer. After the Civil War, he went to work for VMI, Virginia Military Institute, and was the art professor there, the leader of the art department. And it's there that he painted many of the portraits that we might associate with Washington, including portraits of Confederate generals who died in battle. In fact, his posthumous portrait of Jeb Stuart is one of the better known depictions of Stuart. But of course, as I said, 1859, Washington is awarded the commission to paint this really large image of Chief Justice John Marshall. And here we have an image of it hanging in the Fauquier County courthouse to give you an idea of the scale of this piece. It's about 9 feet by 5 feet. So Marshall is shown almost in scale, in one-on-one scale here. And we can tell that while it's based on the 1831 portrait in terms of, where his facial proportions, his expressions, even kind of the position of how he's seated in his chair, the rest of the portrait came from Washington, came from maybe a model that he had seated for it, maybe a still life, a genre scene that he had set up, but is really coming from his own mind. So when Brooke wins the commission from the House of Representatives to do another large-scale portrait of Marshall, the House is asking him to reproduce this larger image, this large piece that we see. And so it again kind of fits in with Brooke's persona already, because it just so happens that Richard Norris Brooke studied art at VMI and then also became an art teacher there shortly after Washington passed away. So it's in his hometown. The man who painted the piece that he's supposed to base it on was his teacher, and he has a studio here in Warrenton and can come and paint in the courthouse very, very easily. So Brooke was very glad to earn this commission. I think he saw it as something he was very capable of doing, even though it wasn't something that he was going to be able to put a big personal spin on, since it's a copy of a portrait. He was looking forward to doing something, I think, of this size and of this caliber. So we're going to go ahead and get a closer look. So this is an image of the piece that is now hanging in the Capitol building. So this is the piece that Brooke executed based on the piece that Washington executed based on a piece that Inman produced that was probably based on the exact original 1831 that Inman produced in Philadelphia in 1831. Fast forward, now we are in 1880. Brooke is painting this piece, and while he, is going through it, let's go ahead and take a look at what is going on in this image. So, of course, we have Chief Justice John Marshall. He's in his judicial robes, and yet this doesn't feel so stiff as a portrait. The robes add a lot of volume to Marshall. He, as a figure, is actually rather small on this canvas, even though the canvas is so big. The Warrenton courthouse piece is 9 by 5. The U.S. Capitol piece is like 12 by 7. It's big. It's a lot of paint going onto this canvas. And so Marshall, seated, has these robes that kind of help fill out his space and center him and ground him on the canvas. We see a couple of things that are particular to Marshall going on here. Probably the best one is the fact that he's wearing his knee breeches. And this was something that Marshall was supposedly known to do, even though knee breeches had fallen out of favor, by the 1820s. At the latest, that people aren't wearing these stockings and these buckle shoes anymore. So Marshall has a bit of that antiquated look to him, but it also lends a sense of founding fatherliness, for lack of a better term. The idea that he has a foot both in the founding of the country and in establishing the modern systems and modern values that we're going to be thinking about, not just in the 1880s, but then through to today as well. We also notice that he's in, again, kind of a nebulous space. We're not being told exactly where he is. We see a very strong column off behind his left shoulder. And then there's also a rail there, which, suggests the old Supreme Court chamber. Looks very Capitol, looks very Washington, looks very official. We've also got this big draped red curtain over his right shoulder, and then of course that beautiful carpeting at his feet. You'll notice that he's sitting on a platform, kind of a dais, and so he's literally being elevated. He's literally being raised up for the viewers to look at. And yet, this isn't a super stiff formal pose. He's sitting kind of, off center, cattywampus, contrapposto in a chair, if you will. He's leaning, with one shoulder onto the table, and there are books scattered at his feet. And this could be symbolism, the fact that the law is literally at the feet of John Marshall, or that, he's the foundation of the law. But it could also be a nod to the idea that this is a working man, and we might assume that maybe his study isn't always perfectly organized. Maybe he's like you and me, and when they're in the middle of a project, they just have stuff everywhere, which is why I'm not showing you my desk while I'm shooting this video. So 1880, this portrait of John Marshall is executed, and we actually have an entry in Richard Norris Brooks's art journal. He kept a journal of many of the pieces that he did over his 50-odd year career. He actually wrote a little bit about what it was like trying to get this portrait figured out with the government. So in February of 1880, he writes, so the price stipulated at $800, and Senator Voorhees promised to secure $1,500. But the appropriation was cut down by the opposition of Senator Edmunds in pure churlishness to $500, which I had to accept. So while he's painting this, they're working out the prices, but it's only after he's finished with it that he finds out he's going to be paid, even less than what he had originally agreed to, and significantly less what he had been promised originally. For a kind of scope of reference, $500 is the same price that Fauquier paid to William Washington, years ago, 20 years ago or so. So not the price I think that most people would expect to receive for a piece of this size and this caliber. But again, as Brooke noted, he had to accept it. Now, this is not, of course, the last story that I have to share about Brooke. This is the end result of the 1880 portrait, but there's another interesting anecdote or two associated with the Fauquier Courthouse and this portrait of John Marshall. Not too long after Brooke's portrait was hung in the Capitol in 1889 in Fauquier, in Warrenton actually, there was a fire at the courthouse. During an election celebration, there are conflicting reports whether it was because of the fireworks or whether a certain opposition party member effigy was being burned, outside of the courthouse building. But the courthouse actually catches fire and burns down. And according to a couple of different sources, it's actually Richard Norris Brooke and a few other individuals who saved this portrait from the courthouse while it is burning. So that's fun, that it was rescued. And then several years later, after the new courthouse was built in 1909, another portrait was added to this wall. And that portrait is the portrait that we see on the upper left-hand corner. And that's a portrait of James Bass Brooke, who was a one-time mayor and also a judge in Warrenton. And if you notice, James Bass Brooke was, of course, Richard Norris Brooks's father. So Brooke actually painted this portrait of his own father to be hung in the courthouse next to the portrait of Marshall that was painted by his one-time teacher of EMI. So a lot of fun connections there in the Fauquier County Courthouse in Warrenton, and hopefully gives you guys all something else to think about when you're thinking about Warrenton. If you're traveling through Fauquier, if you have to go pay a parking ticket or something like that, it gives you an idea that there's a lot of history underneath the surface in the heritage area, and that some of our heritage area figures also have a much broader reach, than just beyond our 5 counties here. So it's a lot of fun learning about Brooke and where his artwork ended up and the impact that it made. If you're interested in learning more about Richard Norris Brooke, I encourage you to go to our See It, Save It blog, which you can find at mosbyheritagearea.org, and read a little bit more about him. All right, well, I think that is all for me today. We'll look forward to coming to you again soon. Thanks so much and have a good day.